In this episode of Careers That Matter, I'm joined by the great Canadian writer and anthropologist, Wade Davis. Wade, welcome.
Hi, Stu.
How do you characterize what your job is? Or is that too narrow of a term?
Well, you know, the word job comes from the medieval French word gobert, meaning to devour. And
I thought it was just over broke.
No, I like the word work in English, which is sort of Anglo-Saxon for create. And, you know, I've never really had a job, you know, in that sense. I think a vocation is just a lens through which you experience the world for a time, and just for a time. You know, the definition of what your job is, I suppose, is what you're doing in the moment. You know, creativity, we're always raised to believe that creativity exists in the abstract, as if, you know, Sally's creative, or, you know, John Lennon was creative, or whatever. And the implication being that you can't be creative because maybe your circumstances, well, that's just not true. Everybody's creative, and creativity is never the motivation of action, it's a consequence of action. That was the biggest lesson I learned. You can't be creative if you don't do. And so, you know, I suppose if I had to distill what I do in one word, it'd be a storyteller.
And how do you go about collecting the materials of your stories? Because as the great Roman orator Cicero said, you have to go out and gather the information that's going to allow you to tell the story. So what's that process that you go through to gather that information?
Well, you know, I've written 25 books. I've made 40 films, you know, so, you know, each one. I think, you know, thinking about careers, maybe you should step back a bit. You know, like, I think one of the myths that's laid on young people, in school in particular, is that life's linear. You know, you go through 12 years and then you go A to B to C, and if you don't skip D and E and F, you'll never get to the rest of the alphabet. And life, in my experience, I think the experience of most people, is not linear at all. It's based on these kind of serendipitous moments, these crossroads, as Joseph Campbell spoke about, where you're faced with an option in life and you have to decide. And the critical thing at that moment is that you generate some kind of internal compass so that you're not listening to the voices of your friends, your parents, the society, whatever, and you're making your own decision.
And so then, therefore, does every single decision then matter?
It matters only in the sense that every decision leads to another phase of your life. And I think the greatest creative challenge in life is to be the architect of that life. And I find that in older age, you know, the people that tend to fall into bitterness and regret are those who look back on a life of decisions or choices imposed upon them from external forces. And happiness in old age comes to those who look back without regret on a life of choices that they've made for themselves. Now, all of those, you could say that all of those choices weren't perfect. You might say, I could have gone that, but it's almost even psychotic to do that, because every choice that you made led to where you are today. Yeah. And I think in my case, you know, I grew up in a very simple Canadian middle-class family, a loving family, but both my parents had suffered in many ways. My father in the war, his parents died in a car accident. My mother's father died of the Spanish flu at 3. She was a single mom in 1946, having married this drunk RAF ace and everything. So by the time we came along, they just, you know, were kind of content just to live a little suburban life. And I, outside of Montreal, and I just felt that if I didn't get out of there, I was going to die. And so I began at a very early age, prompted by my mom, who was a humble but determined Canadian woman, to jump off cliffs. And I only had one word in my vocabulary, and that was yes, for any new experience. And that really worked well. And it overall, you know, built up a kind of a repertoire that kept building on its own. And part of that was, you know, becoming an opportunist, not in terms of a schemer, but putting yourself in the way of opportunities where there was no choice but success, no option but success, and you suddenly find yourself capable of achieving things that would have been beyond imaginings a few months before.
So for so many people, they go, I'm not going to do that. So what were determining factors? Would you say it was courage, or was it curiosity that drove you to make those decisions?
It wasn't, I didn't have an option. Yeah. You know, one of the things that in looking back, I never knew necessarily what I wanted to do. In fact, I was incredibly confused and tormented by that confusion in my early 20s. But I kept moving ahead, and I never compromised. I didn't know how to compromise, even when I wanted to compromise. At one point I came out of a logging camp, and I'd been 2 years in the Amazon, and I applied to law school and graduate school at Harvard in botany as if they were the same thing. And I got into both. And I went to pick up my sister at her law firm, and there was this wonderful receptionist, and she took one look at me and she said, "Are you Karen's brother Wade? You just came back from the Amazon. You eat these weird plants. You follow me." And she dragged me back to the law library. She ordered me up a ladder that brought me face to face with a lithograph of a British solicitor in the 19th century, hooked nose, big fat, wig. And she called up from the base of the ladder, "Is that you?" And I no, I walked down, she took me by the hand to the front door. I called the university, retracted my law school application. I went off to study botany. But
so she dissuaded you from...
She was like a fairy godmother.
Okay.
And, Jim Whittaker, the first American to summit Everest, always says, if you're not living on the edge when you're young, you're taking up too much space. And I mean, everything I did, my mother, in her wisdom, sent me to Columbia when I was 14 for 12 weeks, where I lived with a family, and there were sort of 6 boys, 6 Canadian lads taken down by a school teacher. And I was the youngest at 14, and they were 16 and 17, and almost all of them succumbed to what the Colombians call mamitis, which is homesickness. And I felt, to the contrary, that I finally found home, And it's interesting because now I'm an honorary Colombian citizen. I'm working at the presidential level on all kinds of initiatives, and all of that grew from that seed my mother sowed. And I always felt, I never felt that there was any limits to what I could do. I applied to Harvard, not really even knowing where it was, but I thought it had to be interesting. And what happened is I was fighting forest fires when I was 15 in the fire camps, and we were these obedient, obsequious Canadian lads, and one of the draft dodgers, there was tons of draft dodgers because it's the only work they could get, and one of them had the Harvard student strike of 1969 on the cover of Life magazine. And I kind of thought at 15, that's got to be where you go to be cool like these guys,
Uh-huh.
And then I went off to Harvard, and my mom made a mistake. She sent me down, and I was alone at Logan Airport at 16, and I didn't know where Harvard was. And I saw this guy with a Harvard t-shirt. I thought, he's got to know. He didn't know either. So I dragged my trunk through the subway because my family didn't take taxis. And then I came up in Harvard Square in a complete madhouse, STS and, Hare Krishna. And my mom had made a mistake, and the dorms weren't open for 5 days, and it was a holiday, and I had no money. So I had to drag my trunk through Cambridge until I found a church, and I knocked on the door, and a pastor took me in, put me up for a week, and I fell in love with America that moment. But he was a war resister, and his basement was full of weathermen about to escape to Canada. So I was completely radicalized. And so I spent my first year basically making trouble. We made the last Harvard University strike over the bombing of Haiphong Harbor in '72. And then the day to declare your academic major was the next morning, and I hadn't given it a thought. And I happened to walk out the next day from the Peabody Museum of Ethnology, and with my head still whirling with these dioramas of these sort of cultures from around the world, I ran into a friend in the street. I said, "Stuart, what are you going to declare tomorrow for your major?" He said, "Anthropology." I said, "What's that?" "Well, you read about Indians." And like Forrest Gump, I said, "That'll do." And that's why I signed. And then 2 years later, I was sick of just reading about Indigenous people in books. I wanted to live with them. And I was in the cafe in Harvard Square. I mean, you can't just make this stuff up. There was a National Geographic map on the wall, and my roommate, David, looked at the map, looked at me. He was an anthropology student too. Looked at me, and he pointed to the high Arctic. Well, I had to go somewhere. My left hand lifted up and hit the Northwest Amazon. Now, if it had hit Italy, I might have become a Renaissance scholar. That's what I mean by serendipity. Mm-hmm. But having decided to go to the Amazon, there was only one man to see, the legendary botanical explorer who sparked the psychedelic era with his discovery of the magic mushrooms in Mexico in 1938, Richard Evans Schultes. So I went up to his 4th floor office, his Erie, at the top of the Botanical Museum, and I knocked, and I said, "Professor Schultes, my name's Wade Davis. I'm from British Columbia. I've saved up money in a logging camp. I want to go to the Amazon and collect plants like you did." And instead of asking me for my credentials, or he was a great Anglophile, so I think the British caught his, and then Columbia, he thought I was talking about his beloved Columbia, not British Columbia. But instead of asking me for credentials or who my father was or what courses I had taken, this man for whom mountains had been named in South America, literally, just said, well, son, when do you want to go? And 2 weeks later, I landed in Bogota with no plans, 2 letters of introduction from Schultes that might as well have been written by God, if not Charles Darwin, and no plans whatsoever. And I remember very specifically stepping off that ladder coming down from the plane and my foot hitting the tarmac at El Dorado Airport, and it almost froze. It almost stuck. And because I suddenly realized, oh, I'm here and I have no plans. I got a year or more, and then I just remember the step, the next foot went ahead, and that, and that's how it's always been. I've always just responded, to. I mean, one of the troubles I have at 70, famously, is saying no to anything, because my entire life has been built by saying yes. So that, after I'd worked years in the Amazon, I mean, the other thing is nothing's beneath you. Nothing's a waste of time if you make it so. So, for example, after I'd worked in the Amazon, and, I came back to British Columbia, and I always worked in the summers as a park ranger, and I was working at Haida Gwaii. And the fall came around, I didn't know what to do, and I didn't like what I saw of industrial forestry, but I didn't want to not know what I was talking about. So I lied about my credentials and hired on as a forestry engineer. A friend of mine covered me for 2 weeks, and I picked it up, and I stayed there for a year, more than a year, in a logging camp. And that was probably the best experience I've ever had, as valuable as 4 years at Harvard. And when we had the big battles in the woods in the 80s, in Carmana and Clayoquot and so on, I was one of the spokespeople for the environmental side, if you will, who no one could ever say you don't know what you're talking about. And once, in fact, there was a great moment. Jack Monroe and I were interviewed live in the same television show in BC. I think it was BC. I can't remember, National. And
Probably Webster.
He was furious. It was a television show. He was furious that this young green whippersnapper had been, without his knowledge, put beside him for this. It felt like a setup to both of us.
Yeah.
But just before he went, he was dripping sweat of indignation. And he was probably the most powerful man in British Columbia at the time.
Yes, he was. Yeah.
And just before he went to air, I leaned over to him and I said, excuse me, Mr. Monroe, I just, always wanted to have a chance to thank you. Your union put me through university. And he said, what are you talking about? Well, sir, your union put me through university. Where'd you log? Dean and Bay. What was your log? What was a TFL 39?
Yeah.
And then we went to air, and I proceeded to say exactly what I'd planned to say about what I thought was corruption in industry, mostly in government, and the fact that the men and women in the woods were not the enemy. Those fighting off hunger with a chainsaw were not the enemy. And everything I said, I knew that Mr. Monroe knew to be true.
Yeah.
Jack knew it to be true. He couldn't say it. He was the head of the IWA. But before that interview was over, he had his arm around my shoulder, and he was saying, I don't speak as good as this kid because I didn't get to go to college. But I'm telling you, this is the kind of fine young man my union makes for the province of British Columbia. Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah.
It really happened, and he was wonderful. But, so that logging camp, and then I go back to Harvard, and one day Schultes pulls me into his office and says, how'd you like to go down to Haiti, infiltrate the secret societies, and secure the formula of a drug used to make zombies? Sure. Thinking it might be a 2-week lark, it consumed 4 years of my life.
Wow.
And then here's another thing. I mean, here's another way, just to kids to understand how careers happen. I knew I wasn't going to be an academic. I went back to graduate school certain I wasn't going to be an academic. I had no interest in being an academic, but I knew something interesting would come out of another 5 or 6 years of association with this legendary figure, Professor Schultes. And that zombie project was the brain child of a man called Nathan Klein, the father of psychopharmacology. He had won 2 Lasker Awards, really prominent, and the Psychiatric Institute in Port-au-Prince he had set up. It was named for him. And of course, the interest was if there was this drug that could make someone appear to be dead, the medical potential of it. So they created a dummy foundation called the International Psychiatric Research Foundation. and it was an unknown benefactor. But if I needed $10,000 by Friday, I just had to call New York by Monday. Pretty good for a graduate student. Turns out, and I'd come back from Haiti with these stories to tell Klein, and then one day I came back in his Upper East Side penthouse. There was this kind of toad-like figure in the corner of the living room. Well, that was David Merrick, the Broadway producer, who had just made a fortune with 42nd Street.
Right.
And he had been funding my research, unbeknownst to me. And so I took Mr. Merrick to Haiti. He loved the theatricality of voodoo. And he was seen in this story, a Hollywood movie. And then suddenly Klein died during routine heart surgery. A day later, Merrick had a debilitating stroke. So I went from being flush with money to having none. And years before in Colombia, I had guided a British journalist across the Darien Gap, and he wrote a kind of lousy book called The Rucksack Man, but he was very generous to me, and he introduced me to a literary agent. I walked off the street in London, and I said, I want to be a writer. And this British guy looked down his nose, as they all do for Canadians, and, well, there might be something in that zombie thing, you know. Before I knew it, I had a book contract. I took my girlfriend to Paris, and with what was left of the money, finished the research, but then I had to write a book. And I read 2 chapters I thought was the best thing since the Bible, and the publisher in New York said, try again. And I left the university. I moved to a farm in Virginia where my friend looked after me because I had malaria and hepatitis for months. And I just taught myself to write. And I wrote Circling the Rainbow in 7 months. It was edited in a single day, and it sold 500,000 copies. So suddenly I was a writer. You know, that's how life works. You know?
I wish we had more time to go over your entire career, but what's the one thing that you want somebody who might be looking at you as an example of what is possible? What do you say, this is what?
I would say that pessimism is an indulgence, despair an insult to the imagination, orthodoxy the enemy of invention. Never compromise. Do what needs to be done, and only then ask whether it was possible. And above all, be patient and give your destiny time to find you.
Thank you.